Welcome to Uppsala University and to Uptalk Weekly. Uptalk Weekly is a popular science seminar series given by the Faculty for Science and Technology at Uppsala University. This seminar series is created to give alumni and everyone who is interested a possibility to meet and interact with our researchers and to learn more about the scientific work they are conducting. So if you'd like to ask a question or questions today to our guest, you are welcome to do so whenever during this seminar in the chat. My name is Lina Source Emilsson. I work at Uptech with the assignment to build bridges between the technology competences at our university and the surrounding society. Today, I'm your host when we meet Doris Rusch, professor in game design and a researcher with a great commitment to investigate how game design and a mindset of playfulness can empower a transformation of self and others. Doris is also the author to the book Making Deep Games. Like television and movies, games can be a media that currently is undergoing a dynamic shift in content and perception, with both evolving styles, genres, and themes. In contrast to gamification, that is adding game mechanics onto a non-game environment, deep game design explores systematic approaches for how to approach complex abstract concepts, inner processes, and emotions, all through game design elements and game principles. Deep game design aims to shed light on how to make the complex aspects of being human tangible through gameplay experiences. Today, Doris and I will talk about how to make games that tackle the whole bandwidth of the human experience, games that teach us something about ourselves. The question is, can games make us shift our perspectives, our behavior, our relationships, and our way of interacting with the world around us? Can deep game design and a mindset of playfulness lead us to feel more empowered, empathetic, aware, engaged, and skilled? Is it possible to create a game that can contribute to a meaningful life? Welcome to Uptalk Weekly, Doris.
Thank you very much for this introduction, Lina.
Thank you. Thank you. Happy to have you here. I would like you to start up by introducing yourself, your background, and tell us a little bit about your research in your own words.
Okay, we'll do so. So my background is actually in the humanities. When I tell people that I'm a game designer, they immediately ask if I'm a programmer. I am not. I could not program to save my life, but I understand texts and how we communicate ideas and concepts through different kinds of media. I started with literature. I explored a lot around film, theater, and movies. Yeah, that's film. And now for the last 15 plus years, it's been games. And coming from the humanities and coming also from a strong interest in psychology and philosophy, I always wanted to know, okay, how could we express the human experience through games? How can we make games that are about something, that really get us to think deeply and feel deeply and explore new thoughts about ourselves and the world through action in the game? And that brought me, when I was a postdoctoral researcher at MIT, brought me to my studies around metaphors, structural metaphors, taken from cognitive linguistics and Johnson and Lakoff's work. That was very, very influential for me. And I've built a lot of my work for a decade actually around this, developing theories and then applying them to actual little metaphorical games about the human experience.
So you say structural metaphors. What is structural metaphors? Do you like explain? With you.
Basically, all metaphors are structural metaphors. So if I say, for example, life is a highway, that's an example my students are very, very well aware of because I bring it every time I teach the Deep Games course. Then there is a lot to this image, right? So this metaphor has a lot of different dimensions, just like life has a lot of different dimensions. That's why one works to understand and make sense of the other. And these dimensions have to match. So for example, in my life, I am the driver and I would be the driver on the highway. I have a journey that I go through, which is the journey I could take in a car. If I take an exit, that stands for making a decision in life. If I have an accident on the highway, that could stand for having misfortune in my life. If I have a breakdown in my car, that means maybe I have to stop and take a pause. So these are all these different dimensions that make up the structure of the metaphor that maps onto the structure of the more abstract concept that I want to communicate with it.
Can we talk a little bit about what is games for you? So how would you explain what is a game for you?
Yeah, so there is a very, very basic definition of games, which I like to give because it is so basic. It's that there is a goal and there is a conflict you have to overcome towards that goal. And you use certain means, like mechanics, actions you take on a moment by moment basis to overcome the conflict towards your goal. And every action you take in the game that gets you closer or further away from the goal is a change in the state of the system of the game overall. This is the most basic definition. And I don't really like the more elaborate definitions because the more we refine what a game is, the less opportunity we give for this medium to grow and develop and become something else. So we want games to still reach some state of maturity, and we still want to push the envelope of what games can be. If we lock down with the definition what they are, we're sort of shoveling our own grave. So that's why I want to keep it with the very, very basic components of what a game is.
Okay, so words that I often hear when we talk about games today is gamification, as I also mentioned, but also serious games. And now you are introducing to us today deep games. So can you help us to understand what is the difference between gamification, serious game, and deep games?
I will do my best. I think there is a lot of flux and sometimes overlap between these different concepts. And I'm not sure if very harsh boundaries actually serve us very well. But gamification, how it is mostly understood, is that there is a game structure that is mapped on top of a task that tends to be boring and mundane. And by turning it into something more game-like, the hope is the task becomes more appealing and people will do it because the assumption is everybody likes to play games. So the moment you give somebody a goal and they can win something, they're more motivated to do something that's otherwise really, really boring. But gamification, usually there is another intent, there is another purpose to it than just entertaining the player. So in entertainment games, the star of it is the player. We designed them to bring joy and entertainment to the player. But in gamification, we don't really care so much about the player. The player is just a means to an end. But for people, who are the players in this case, to do what this intent is, we think we have to give them some kind of structure so they actually do it. So it's basically about controlling people in a very subtle and seductive way so they do our bidding. Like, how do you get somebody to collect trash in the park? Well, you put up a really funny looking trash can that is a creature that you can feed. And so it's much more appealing to actually collect the trash and feed the creature. And maybe the creature even, gives a sign of satisfaction in the end when it's full. Great, task accomplished, park is clean. Now, serious games is, I think it's a very unlucky term in a way, because we want to play games because they're fun. Then you slap the adjective serious onto them. Who wants to play a serious game? It was a serious game. And so these are also games that have a purpose beyond entertainment, clearly, because they're serious. And they usually have some kind of learning or training purpose. You're supposed to do something real and serious when you engage with them, but still with the benefit of, ooh, it's a game. And we all love to play games. However, we all love to play good games. And yeah, so that sometimes takes a bit of a step back when we when we come up with serious games. And all sorts of learning games and simulation, training simulations, and games for change in general, and games for health have sort of this label of serious games. There are a lot of subcategories to this. And then there are deep games, and I feel very conflicted about claiming this as my term or as its own category. I was forced at some point, to define how I call what I'm doing. And I said, well, I'm interested in games that are, deep in the sense of you play them and you go, ooh, that's deep. Like, ooh, you said something really smart. That's so deep. And now suddenly this is a thing. And then I had to define it more. And since these are metaphorical games, the way I define this is, as a metaphorical game, you interact with the metaphor. That's the surface of the game, right? That is the really literal part of it that you interact with. But underneath that surface, beneath, in the depth of it, is the true meaning of this. And that's where the deep games comes from. However, everybody who plays a game that gives them an insight can say, this is a deep game. I will not come and say, and now you owe me 0.5 cents for this, right? And also there are entertainment games that can be deep and serious games that can be metaphorical. So they are also deep games. Long answer.
So let's dig into this deep game, the sparkling game, the wow games that give us some insight. How can we make games that can teach us something about ourselves and can give us this sparkle, this feeling of deepness?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? Well, the way I approach it, there is no recipe, I think, but the way I approach it in the deep games approach, and it's just an invitation for designers, it's just a tool in the toolbox, I think, would be to start with something personally meaningful, because I think what is the most resonating for others is the deeply personal. And we know that from psychology too, and from psychotherapy, that the things that are most resonating are not the ones that are most general, it's the most heartfelt, because at a very deep human level, we all go through the same stuff, maybe in different forms and has different expressions, and we deal with it differently. But there is an essence to being human that we can relate to. So I start with very personal experiences, usually. And then I explore them through all sorts of tools that allow me access to my unconscious. I cultivate that a lot. So I do dream work. I write down what I dream and I try to make sense of it by using the one sentence dream hack that I learned from Eric Goodwin, who is a psychiatrist, and he's done a lot of Jungian studies. And he says, so this dream is a representation of X in my life. What does it tell me about my life right now? So I do this. And I use other means of conjuring up imagery and symbolism and metaphors to start with. And when I arrive at a metaphor that captures the experience that I think I want to model in a game, then I start digging into it. What are the different dimensions that I mentioned, with the very trivial highway image? What are the dimensions of that metaphor that just bubbled to the surface from my own depths? And so I go back and forth between that metaphor and the quality of the experience I try to grasp, because they inform each other. The metaphor also allows you to see the experience better. And then I go and dig deeper into the experience, and that fleshes out the metaphors. And sometimes it breaks down and I realize, okay, this is really not the way to go. And I have to discard it and find another one, but it's all part of the process. And I have a tool. I developed a tool. I don't know if you can call it developing, but I call it the inner game designer conversation. And the inner game designer asks pointed questions about and uses game structure to guide the dialogue. So it says, what is really the win here? How do you win life, for example? And what's at stake? What's at stake? What do you get from this? What will this give you? And what's the conflict? Why is this hard? And it's always asking the next questions, like a coach. It doesn't let you get away with just the superficial answer. It digs deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And it's important to do this in writing. My students often try to do it in their head because they think now they got it. And then I said, have you written it down? No. Well, why don't you write it down? Oh yeah, that was so good. Told you. So I do that a lot of times.
So what is good about writing it down?
It makes it concrete. You can bullshit a lot in your head, right? You can get away with just glossing over stuff and you think you know it all, but you really don't. And taking the time to spell it out and writing down and letting it percolate through that, making it more concrete, more concrete, more concrete. That process of pinning things down, as is the nature of metaphor also, making the abstract concrete. That's what is needed to really flesh out the details and understand the experience. Because very often we go through life and we have experiences and we have very superficial understandings of what we mean, the tacit knowledge of a lot of stuff, like what is loyalty? Yeah, we have sort of an idea, but if we have to really pin it down, it's not that easy.
Can you give an example for the people listening here of a deep game that you have done where you have worked with this, so we can get like some understanding of how a game can be working out?
Of course, yeah.
So if you talk about your game that is coming up, Witches.
The Witches Way.
Yeah. So how have you worked with this in the Witches Way? And my next question that will come is, how do you study this? What kind of scientific knowledge do we get from it? But start by explaining the Witches Way.
Thanks for the warning on the tough question. No, so the Witches Way, I think it's a deep game, but it also goes beyond that. So my research also has evolved to questions around existential games and games for a meaningful life. And so I don't think that every deep game necessarily asks existential questions, because that's mostly characterized by its metaphorical nature and has something to do with the human experience. And obviously there are overlaps. But then I very, very specifically looked into how can we make games that contribute to a meaningful life. And I started with existential psychotherapy and the existential concerns, which is death, freedom to make choices in life, isolation and meaninglessness and identity. And then I looked into, I think I'm answering your second question first.
That's okay.
Thank you. Then I looked into mythology and how mythical narratives have served as patterns to make sense of our senseless existence. Since there is no external meaning really, other than what we give our life, myths have been used to help us orient ourselves on our journeys. They're actually emotional or psychological patterns that we can project outwards. So I looked a lot into how existential psychotherapy is working with myth and where mythical imagery actually comes from. And it's bubbling up from the unconscious. And the idea that there is a universal unconscious, very, very tricky. So I don't want to get all... I look at this as a creative and as an artist and as somebody who has a deep interest in these themes from a psychological perspective, but I don't want to make any claims now about how scientifically proven the universal unconscious is necessarily, please. So, and also, so symbolisms and ritual as a symbolic action, because myth is an acted ritual. So rituals are myths that have mechanics. And that's very suitable to look at as an inspiration source for games, because games have mechanics. So we can perform actions in games that have a symbolic quality. I'm not talking about the Witches Way yet, because that's a Twine game, which means it's a text-based game where you have different links you can click on and choose your next step through the links you click on. So it's a slightly different case. But there is a really cool game called Spirits of Spring that Ruben Fares has designed. And there it's about bullying, and you're building bridges. You're the guardian of springtime, and the bullies bring eternal winter and they want to take it away. So this imagery is really, really beautiful and deep. And I think coldness as something that symbolizes isolation is quite of a universal archetype or universal image. And the mechanic is a ritual action where you build these bridges. So in the Witch's Way, the way I work with this is I thought a lot about finding your own voice, finding your identity as an existential concern, finding meaning, but it starts with, who am I really? What drives me? And how have I been cut off from this really authentic, aligned place through a lot of the structures that our society, our culture, our families, all of the big and large cultures and small cultures we are part of have a tendency to drive us towards what they want from us and think is good for us, and often away from what is really good for us. And so getting back to that unique, aligned, authentic place, to me, is very, very important, is what the first part of the Witch's Way is all about. And I started working with, okay, what is some symbolism, some imagery that speaks to me around this? And it had a lot to do with my inner dog, like the joy, that pure, unalterated joy of just being a sensual creature in nature, you know, smelling the good smells and just going for it in this wordless and holistic sense. And then that became part of the narrative, and overwriting old beliefs and assumptions from others with our own affirmations. I can do what I want. I am enough. I got this covered, things like that. So it's all part of the structure, and it's all part of the imagery that's used.
So we are talking about transformation by inner understanding of self, transformation of self. But how can we work with these kind of games for transformation of others? And this is something everybody is doing today. You know, anyone who has a company, anyone who has an organization, anyone who has any social interaction or teams are working with this. So how can you work with games for transformation of others? And deep games.
So, yeah, right.
How do you see what are your thoughts about that? Let's put it like that.
That's a really good question. My spontaneous and maybe somehow flippant response to this is, we have no business. We have no business transforming others. How dare we? I find it really presumptuous. I find it imposing. I find it disrespectful. I understand where it's coming from, and gosh, have I wanted to change people in my life? You know, I'm right there with you, or everybody who has that desire. And I understand the need that transformations are possible, but I also believe that we can't force it. We can't make people change ever. If we try to do this, it will backfire. But having said that, in this provocative, flippant way, I do think that we can make heartfelt, authentic, appealing invitations. We can make offers to others to look at what they could do for themselves to have more aligned, holistic, joyful lives. And if we start there, if people are empowered to be their best selves, and we use games and playful experiences and structures and whatnot to that end, not to just force a behavior, and not to always constantly hope that people then will fall in line and do our bidding. If it doesn't come from a place of power over, but power with and for others, then I think we can do a whole lot of good. But it's a very, very tricky line, a very slippery slope to not try and abuse this and force people into something, because damn it, we have the technology. It should be possible for us to get them to do exactly what we want from them.
So you are just become a professor in game design, one of the first. And how do you look upon game design and game as an academic subject? What are the important questions What are the hypotheses that needs to be addressed? What are your thoughts about that?
It's a huge field, of course. It's actually a very, very multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary field. So when I speak to this, then I speak to it from the background of what we do at our department, and then more specifically what I do at our department, because even at our department, we have people with different expertises and different questions and hypotheses. But I think that we need to understand the human experience even better, and also from a rather scientific angle. So far, I've mostly dealt with the creative and artistic and expressive part coming from the humanities, and also just defining more as somebody who's quite creative. But I'm also very analytical, and I want to understand how things work. And that's why I studied clinical and mental health counseling when I was in this whole Games for Change space. I didn't finish, but I studied it for a year to understand how people change, and I still don't understand it. But now I've become really, really interested in, and you know this because we had this conversation yesterday about the brain, right? And how do we need to take this into account if we design experiences? What is so incredibly potent about games as a medium, which no other medium was able to do, is that it allows these firsthand experiences. You don't just witness somebody else going through something, you go through something. And if we don't understand how our brains respond to certain stimuli, how our brains learn really, how our brains can toggle between different circuits that make us more empathetic or turn this off, how can we design for empathy if we don't know what's happening up there when we engage in a specific game structure, in a specific task or environment? How can we even start to begin designing with intent and purpose? And then how do we know it works? What are all the different things we can look at to understand better how what we're doing isn't just, evaporating in the void, but really, and also not overly simplistic. We can measure all sorts of things, but then mostly what we measure is really boring and not that insightful. How can we get at the good stuff?
So if we talked about the science part, then we have what you call in games bleed and bleed over and bleed in, where actually this knowledge is moving into the society. Where do you think this will have the biggest impact in the society, knowledge about how games work?
Now I really wish my colleague was here, Sarah Lynn Bowman, because she's such an expert in bleed, and I'm borrowing this term from the role-playing community. I think it would have a very big impact everywhere, because we take our transformations into all the contexts. I think that I'm personally very interested in leadership, and personally very interested in organizations and how they work, and transformation through organizations and leadership. How can we create projects that change something in the world? How can we create projects for sustainability and do it in a sustainable way? And so if we use role-playing games, for example, or any kind of playful experience that gets at this deeper level where something resonates and we can explore ourselves in new ways of acting and being in the world, then absolutely, I do want this to have an impact on how that broadens our range of acting and being in contexts outside of the game. If I am aware, we talked yesterday about Jill Bolte Taylor's work on the 4 brain characters, and she's a neuroanatomist. And so how can we explore these 4 characters in our brain and see which one we are in when we are interacting with other people, and switch between them as we need it if we find ourselves stuck in our shadow part, the character 2, that's the linearly organized, emotionally wounded part. How can we step out of this, send it some love, say they're there, and switch into either the analytical part or the playful or whatever.
Yeah. So our half hour is wrapping up very quickly, I must say. But just to summarize up, what I hear you saying is having a playful mindset will make it possible for us to practice moving in between different positions and understand different kind of positions.
Absolutely, Lina.
Thank you, Doris, for joining us today. We are so happy that you took the time to come into Uptalk Weekly.
It's my pleasure.
Next week, Uptalk Weekly will be in Swedish, and we will meet Mattias Orenda Morris, Associate Professor at the Department of Civil and Industrial Engineering. And we will talk about how it's possible to make a better decision in a complex healthcare system by conducting simulations across organization boundaries. That is, from specialist care to primary care and finally home care. With this, Doris and I wish you all a good week, and thank you for joining us today.